All right. Welcome in, everybody. All 6,000 of our attendees here on this webinar. If my camera works, that would be cool. Cool. All right, let's get this thing kicked off, shall we? Let's talk conflict collaboration. It's the holiday season. I'm sure we're all going to have those holiday get-togethers and talk to people that we only may see once or twice a year. We've also went through a rather turbulent political season too that happens every 6 months at this point. So let's talk about how you bridge conflicts collaboration. How do you get aligned in a polarized world? Hopefully this framework gives you some confidence to have really constructive conversations with family members, loved ones, friends that you may only get together a couple times a year, and you may have some varying opinions and views. And it's our belief that we're much more equal than we think, but how we communicate is incredibly important to be able to prove that. So hopefully this framework gives you a lot of confidence to have some really uncomfortable conversations, because by the end of this discussion, hopefully you realize that the more uncomfortable your conversation is, well, the more satisfying it's going to be. Before you start any potentially conflict-rich discussion, uncomfortable conversation, difficult conversation, it's really important to set some ground rules. So here's a framework that we use here at Aligned. I've used in my personal life, and I think it's incredibly important. The first thing that you should do is have a contracting conversation. That means you are expressing your intent. We're going to get to intention and interpretation a little bit later on this session, but you're expressing your intent. You may say things like, my intent is to have a constructive conversation with you, understand your perspective while also sharing my perspective. Think about it from a negotiation standpoint, and we talk about this a lot at Aligned. Having a contracting conversation before a really intense negotiation could also be really beneficial. It's my intent to ensure that this deal is fruitful for both parties and we have a great opportunity to work together in the long term. What I also love to add is, if at any point in time you feel like I haven't heard or understood you, please let me know. And if at any point in time I feel like you haven't heard or understood me, I won't interrupt you. We'll get that for a sec. But I will let you know. Because again, it's my intent to make sure this is a positive, constructive conversation, or from a negotiation standpoint, a positive and constructive negotiation. So have a contracting conversation early, get your intent, get your cards out on the table quickly. Second thing, you need to have some sort of shared truth. Discuss where you get your information. And yeah, this sometimes can be a really uncomfortable conversation for some people, but discuss where you get your information, discuss where your source of truths are. What you're looking for here is overlap. Where can we both find alignment on where we get our facts and information from? What research papers do we find to be credible? What news sources do we find to be truth and fact-based? If there is genuinely no overlap in your shared sense of truth, I would recommend there's no reason to have this conversation. If you're chatting with someone that, I don't know, bought the bee or eats the onion, you probably don't need to have an uncomfortable conversation with them because they're watching satirical websites that, I don't know, aren't true. And they know they're not true. But discuss where you're getting your information from. Discuss what your shared sense of truth is. Third, and I kind of mentioned this in the first one, don't interrupt each other. It's rude. It's inappropriate. It's going to devolve the conversation into an argument. The second you start arguing with someone is the second you're going to start getting farther and farther and farther and farther away from whatever solution or resolution you're trying to go after. Debate can be really healthy, especially if debate is encouraged in the first point, but arguments will devolve the conversation almost immediately into a screaming match. And then, I don't know, I've seen tables flipped. I've seen people get super red in the face, family and friends of my own get super red in the face, start arguing, finger pointing, the works. Not helpful. So the second you notice that argument is happening, go back to point number one, go back to your intent, and have that conversation, that contracting conversation once again. Fourth piece, we talked about that shared overlap, that shared sense of truth. Fact check with impunity. Hey, that sounds interesting. I've never heard that before. Let's go to the data. Hey, that sounds like a really interesting concept. What does so-and-so source say about that? Then go back to probabilities. You have to fact check with impunity. I've done it to myself. There are a lot of things that I've learned over the past 12 to 18 months that I may have had a bias toward, which we'll get to a little bit later, but my research was incomplete. I found more sources, it reframed my understanding, and then I was able to move forward with a different perspective, another thing we're going to talk about. Lastly, if you're having a disagreement, really one of the reasons why we're having this uncomfortable conversation is genuinely we don't agree with each other on the surface. Ask each other and also provide, is there any information that, if available, would allow you to change your mind? I'm not suggesting this information exists, but I'm asking, if information was presented to you, would that be enough to change your perspective? Again, I'll go back to the shared sources of truth. If someone says to you, I don't care what I see, this is what I believe, why are we having this conversation? So the whole point of the ground rules to understand is, are we on the same page in our intent? Do we see truth the same way, and where is overlap? And lastly, why are we having this discussion? If there's no shared truth, there's resistance to fact checking, there's no information that, if it was presented, could change the other person's perspective, well, then there's no reason to have this discussion. So get those ground rules out of the way early. You might save yourself a lot of headaches and a lot of stress. And we don't need to be stressed in the holiday season. We weren't here to drink eggnog and, I don't know, be fat and happy and merry. It's the happiest time of the year. Let's get over ourselves a little bit. All right, cool. Here's our quick agenda for this session. First, we're going to get uncomfortable. Then we're going to acknowledge and analyze the data in front of us. Then we'll understand and humanize both parties' perspectives. And lastly, reframe the challenge, reframe the perspective, and hopefully resolve any differences we may have. And resolving the differences may just be understanding the other party's perspective and realizing that we won't be able to see eye to eye based on our experiences and our beliefs, but at least we can understand and empathize with each other a lot better. First, and the most important thing to realize is these are likely going to be uncomfortable conversations. So stepping into uncomfortable territory on the surface may be something you're averse to. But I'm here to tell you the facts and the research dictate uncomfortable conversations are overwhelmingly more satisfying than surface level small talk. So here are 3 kind of important points to think about when you're getting uncomfortable. We talked about that contracting conversation. Share your feelings. Don't share what you believe in necessarily. Share how you feel, because that empathetic layer is really important to understanding self and understanding others. So a really interesting thing to think about is with the dynamic of offering help. Some people believe that offering help builds trust. I'm here to tell you that's the exact opposite of that. Offering help doesn't build trust. Asking for someone's feelings doesn't build trust. Asking for help builds trust. Sharing your own feelings builds trust. Some people perceive vulnerability as a weakness. Everything else in my life and our experiences here at Align state the opposite. Vulnerability is a strength. Controlled vulnerability, obviously, but vulnerability is a strength. Share your feelings, be open with your intent, share how you feel, because that'll give someone an understanding and a lens to how you show up and why you show up that way. I read a book not too long ago called The Art of Small Talk. And I was thinking maybe this can help me bridge some gaps and get to know people a lot better. I'm here to tell you, small talk sucks. It's artificial. It's superficial. A lot of the book was about how do you lie to each other about your experiences to try to perceive some shared sense of unity. I thought it was nonsense. So quit the small talk. Maybe even develop a questioning strategy, which I'll get to in a second, that fosters deep connectedness. But get past the small talk. It's boring. It's superficial. It's what you do in line with someone at the grocery store. It's not what you do when you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your friends and loved ones. Get past the surface level nonsense. Get to deeper, richer intention and purposeful related discussions. But in doing so, you got to acknowledge the weight. If you're really getting into controversial topics, you can't shy away from the fact that they will be uncomfortable. And we're going to talk about identity in a little bit. When you're challenging someone's identity, it can get incredibly uncomfortable for that individual or, of course, for yourself. So there's something to being opinionated, but you can't be stubborn. And that's why you go to that shared sense of truth and that contracting conversation early on. But don't shy away from the weight and the gravity of the discussion. That also means part of that contracting conversation, it's going to be important for both parties to sit there and continue the discussion. If someone wants to pull out the second something gets a little bit uncomfortable, we'll go back to the beginning of what we said. Why are we having this discussion? Sit there, enjoy the discussion, enjoy the fruitfulness of it. And our most important thing is assume positive intent, assume empathy, and assume understanding is the goal here. I read another book recently called Super Communicators, which is a phenomenal book about communication. One of the studies they talk about in Super Communicators, also a study that we've researched before, it's called the Fast Friends Protocol. So this is an awesome study that Stony Brook University did not too long ago about the science behind developing fast friends. And what they did is they structured 36 questions. Now, they had hundreds of questions they experimented with, but they ended up structuring down to 36 based on the experiment on how to create a process that develops fast friends. What they did was they grabbed just two strangers off the street and they told these strangers, you're going to have a really uncomfortable conversation about your feelings with someone you've never met before. So what did they say at first, right before they agreed to it? They said, I don't want to do that. They reluctantly agreed to it. They were taking a survey beforehand and said, how uncomfortable are you sharing private, feelings-rich information with someone you've never met before? And overwhelmingly, people said they were uncomfortable with this. They didn't want to do it. They can't believe they committed to doing this. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. They didn't believe that sharing their feelings was going to be something beneficial to them. And it's super cool that overwhelmingly the people that took part in the study found the activity to be immensely satisfying. What did they find? They found out that people ended up being fast friends and they stayed connected for potentially years after the study. A few people ended up dating. A couple people actually got married. Now picture this. You grab two random people off the street. You put them in a room. They're asking 36 questions to each other, being vulnerable, being open. And a couple of them got married. It goes to show you that feelings-rich discussions develop much greater empathy and trust. And this framework is universally applicable. They grab people from all walks of life, all ages, genders, professions, perspectives, experiences, and personalities. And overwhelmingly, they were significantly more satisfied with the discussion that was deeper than surface level small talk. Assume positive intent and share more about your feelings. Based on the research, that's how you develop lasting friendships and bonds. After you've gotten a bit uncomfortable, it's important to acknowledge and analyze. Critical thinking is, sad to say, a bit of a lost art these days. We are inundated with information. And if we don't critically think about that information, chances are we're going to take it at face value. And that could be a really dangerous thing, especially since we're in the attention economy. People are incentivized for commanding your attention. That is why we've gotten farther and farther and farther and farther apart, because the poles have to scream in order to get your attention. Language is more extremist. Research and fact checking is something people shy away from. And critical thinking, especially empathetic thinking, is a bit of a lost art. So how do we acknowledge and how do we analyze? So here are 3 things that we would look at in order to do that. First, let's unpack it. Let's deconstruct that specific line of thinking. And there's a really interesting framework that Harvard uses in Getting to Yes. It's more of an interest-based relational approach, the IBRA method. What you do in that framework is you get away from the people and you focus more on the problem and the interest. We're all going to have our different beliefs on things, whether they be uncomfortable topics like religion, vaccination, illegal immigration, healthcare, and gun control. I guarantee you are way more similar than you are different when you sit down with your family members and talk about those 5 really, really controversial topics. Get to the interests. What are your true interests on these topics? For the person that brings up religion, it could be a shared sense of community and shared belief system. For someone that isn't religious whatsoever, I'm sure they can buy into a shared community and a shared vision and purpose of the world. If you talk to someone about vaccinations, well, their sense of self, which we'll get to in a little bit, may be a granola, organic, I want to feed my kids the most sensible, sustainable solutions possible. If I get them vaccinated, that's a chemical. But how do we get to the more empathetic level of thinking where maybe child safety is important without challenging someone's sense of self? So separate the people from the problem. Focus on the interests and use objective criteria with those overlapping senses of truth to find where that overlap is. You're going to have to avoid common biases too. Listen, we all have them. And as a really interesting thought experiment, I want you to close your eyes and for a moment, think about what you picture when someone says an illegal immigrant in the US. Obviously, I'm not asking you to share this information because only you have that picture in your head. But if there's 20 to 25 million illegal immigrants in the US, what did you picture? Did you picture the student overstaying their visa? Did you picture the person going across the border in Mexico? Did you picture maybe someone entering the country with fraudulent documents or re-entering after deportation? Did you picture children that may have come here unwillingly from their parents that may have entered the country illegally? Did you think about employment without authorization? Did you think about visitor visas that stayed a little bit extra from their employer because their employer didn't want to necessarily pay the taxes on registering them and signing up for their visa? There are tons and tons and tons of different reasons why people are in the country illegally. We all have our own biases. They're cognitive biases that are shaped by our perspectives and our experiences. We have to recognize that there will be times when those biases may be correct. And there will also be times when those biases are incorrect because they are shaped by our perspectives and our experiences. And fortunately / unfortunately, we haven't perceived and experienced everything. There's always something new for us to learn. So how can you challenge your own biases? How can you look in the mirror? I don't know, little Michael Jackson quote for you there. Make a change. That's going to be the most important thing. Challenge your own thinking. You can be opinionated, but you can't be stubborn. Think about those shared sources of truth. And as I mentioned before, find the overlap. I mean this figuratively and literally. Almost put up that kind of Venn diagram of your interests and your motivators and share where you overlap. I've had really uncomfortable conversations with friends, families, loved ones, and strangers about protecting children. You know, it's really, really important to protect children these days. But if you don't perceive the problem the same way, you might not find that overlap. You have to challenge your thinking and think about what is the true core of your disagreement. You may be more on the same page than you realize. The what and the how may be different, but the why at its core may be exactly the same. We are much more similar than we are different. So find that overlap. A cool kind of thought experiment here is also putting it into practice. Maybe you work for an organization that has a hybrid, full-time at desk, full-time remote policy. You may have employees that want to work from home. The employer might want you back in the office because we're seeing a big push to back at the office. When you deconstruct both of these interests, you may find things like your organization at the corporate level wants shared collaboration, shared sense of unity, better communication. And I'm sure there's also we're paying a lot for rent. We want to be able to use the spaces. I'm sure there's a little bit of that too. On an individual level, they might want flexibility, lifestyle choices and changes they made as they reanalyzed their life during COVID because they were home. And a lot more trust that they can fulfill their duties and do their job without having to be tied to a desk. They may also want to realize I'm spending a half an hour to 2 hours each way every day and the cost associated with it just traveling into the office. What is the net benefit there? By deconstructing both of the interests, I'm sure you can find a significant amount of overlap in both of your perspectives. Next, we need to understand and humanize. And this is about understanding a sense of self and what potentially the roadblocks to misunderstanding could be. It goes without saying, but you kind of have to listen to each other. So active listening is really important. Go back to the don't interrupt each other framework that we talked about before. So listen to understand, don't listen to reply. Think about asking some clarifying questions that don't challenge the idea, but instead you're able to express your interpretation of that concept, belief, or feeling. We're going to get to interpretations in a few. You might use phrases like, hey, it sounds like you're saying this. What I'm hearing is that. How I interpret it is X. And then ask them to either validate or invalidate your perspective on their intention. Invite them in. Hey, it sounds like your belief is we should close the borders and deport everybody. That's what I'm hearing. Is that what you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting you take their position to the extreme, but you have to get a deep and empathetic understanding of what their interests and feelings are. Also, do not invalidate their feelings. You could challenge their beliefs and their information, but do not invalidate their feelings because their feelings are very, very real to them. And you may want to use language like, hey, I can understand how that feels. Take me a little bit deeper. Why do you feel that way? How did you get that perspective? Have those uncomfortable, feeling rich discussions. Then reframe the narrative. Instead of challenging their beliefs, hey, you're wrong about this. That's highly negative. That's highly combative. You may want to say, hey, what would you do if given the controls to design a policy that is both positive and addresses the concerns that you have? That is a solution-focused reframing. So reframe away from the problem toward the solution. That gets people thinking about how. One of the most critical mindsets we talk about from a negotiation standpoint is having a solutions-focused mindset. And that's changing from effectively why to how. Okay, cool. You're given the keys to the castle. What would you do? How would you do it? How can you make sure that solution is lasting and fit for purpose? Let's discuss that. Because again, if we're much more similar than we are different, it's likely that we're going to start to overlap on some of those solutions. And I mentioned it before, being identity aware. This is one of those crucial things to understand when you're having an uncomfortable conversation. People's sense of self is critically important. And when that sense of self and that identity is challenged, people take it as a personal attack. I want you to look inwardly to yourself for a moment. How many identities do you have? If you have all these kind of balls or so in your life, some of those balls are going to be really, really, really big. These are big senses of your identity. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your children. Maybe it's your sense of higher purpose or religion or nonsense of religion. Maybe it's your interests and your hobbies and your sports teams. There are tons of different ways people create their sense of identity. Those people that have fewer senses of identity, that ball's really, really big. And if someone perceives themselves as a, let's say, Democrat, and that is a massive part of their identity, or a Republican, to even consider agreeing with someone that has an R or a D next to their name that isn't the same as yours could almost feel catastrophic. Over the past year, I've chatted with a lot of people that have said, and I quote, "I would never vote for a Democrat. I would never vote for a Republican." You got to unpack that. But if you challenge someone's sense of self, it very well can backfire. So for yourself, understand your own senses of identity. How do I describe me? Well, I'm a husband. I'm a soon-to-be father. I'm a pet owner. I'm obsessed with video games and anime and technology and space. I'm not a religious person. I'm a solution-focused individual. I genuinely believe that you don't need a reason to help people. I'm deeply empathetic. I'm deeply caring. So I've been challenged in my past as being selfish and narcissistic because I can be opinionated. And for me, when I'm challenged on some of those topics, when I believe that you don't need a reason to help people, and I'm deeply empathetic, when that gets challenged, when I get called selfish or stubborn, it's an attack on my personal identity. So my instant reaction back in the day was to get really defensive. But now I seek to understand, hey, how did you get that perspective? Why did you think that? I don't perceive myself that way, but I'm really interested in why and how you've perceived me that way. Can you talk me through it? We have to challenge our own identities, and we have to be open to understanding that people have their own identities. If you don't take this to consideration, what can happen is the backfire effect. This is what happens when people use effectively identity as a shield. I need to protect my sense of self because this is how I view me. And even if you are giving them facts, figures that are tried and true, that are irrefutable, if it's counter to their sense of self, it will backfire and oftentimes rebound in a dramatic way. So you almost have to understand identity and express a bit of your sense of self, and also ask them and understand their sense of self to remove some of that defensiveness. Openly saying I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican or I am a scientist or I'm a Packers fan. When you express some of those sense of selves and some of those identities, it'll start to reduce some of that defensiveness. Because while I show up this way, and these are my interests and these are my hobbies, my sense of self is varied and diverse. And if we're much more similar than we are different, the more we share our identities, the more likely we are to find unity and some overlap. Lastly, reframe and resolve. Our goal in having some of these difficult, polarizing conversations is to foster empathy and foster trust. And hopefully ensure that people don't flip the table by the end of dinner because they don't want to be there anymore. Not as helpful. So, 3 tips on how to foster, reframe, and resolve. One of my core beliefs, and a core belief we have here at Aligned, is there's no such thing as miscommunication. Sorry, doesn't exist. It's an excuse, not a reason. You communicated whether you liked it or not. Your communication might have sucked, but you communicated nonetheless. What does happen, though, are misinterpretations and misunderstandings. That is why it is so critical to be clear with your intent. We talk about this all the time at Aligned. Vague doesn't help anybody. Not sharing your feelings when you feel a certain way is not helping anyone. By expressing how you feel, and of course monitoring your expressiveness and your body language and your tone, when you show up with positive intent, You can have a really conflict-rich discussion with clarity, where your attention and their interpretation and vice versa marry up really nicely. So there's no such thing as miscommunication, but there are such things as misunderstanding. So think about, am I understanding them deeply enough? Do they understand me deeply enough? And you may realize, hey, we understand each other perfectly fine and I still don't see eye to eye, but that's cool too, because at least I get it. Next, in order to reframe and resolve, you have to have a dialogue, not a debate. Debates oftentimes feel very threatening. Debates oftentimes in negative environments turn into arguments. So ask open-ended questions, express how you feel, be vulnerable, ask more about their feelings. That allows you to shift from a debate to a discussion. And then zoom out. Too much today, we're just inundated with information. So zooming out almost feels impossible when new information gets presented to us in the echo chambers that we find ourselves in all the time. You may blame a politician for a certain policy. You may blame a coworker for a certain action. You may blame a family member for a certain stance on a certain topic. It is so critical in this day and age to zoom out. How did we get here? How did your experiences shape that perspective? I understand this is where we are today, but what was life like 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 25 years ago? You know, some people will say, oh, it's worse now than it's ever been. How is that possible? Life expectancy is longer. People are more affluent. There's more humans on the planet than there's ever been. How is it worse? Technology is incredible and amazing. But the way we treat each other, well, that's worse. How polarized we are, yeah, sure, that's worse. Oftentimes, nostalgia tastes a lot better than reality. Think of all those breakfast cereals you had when you were a kid. Have them now. Probably don't taste the same. It's critical that we have to have a wider view on life. Ask yourself, how did we get here? And then you leave the past in the past. There is no thing better than tomorrow, because tomorrow is filled with opportunity. You can't revisit yesterday. Can't happen. We can look to it for some trends and some insights if we're able to zoom out. But you can't relive yesterday. It's useless. The only thing important is tomorrow. And tomorrow's filled with opportunity. So zoom out and think about the future. That's how you also bridge and reframe some of these discussions to how mindsets instead of identity-focused why mindsets. So the last kind of research study for you that we'll talk about here is perspective taking. We've all heard the quote, walk a mile in their shoes. But if you have kind of an inverse relationship with conflict and you kind of try your best to visualize what life is like for them, and if they're able to articulate the perspectives they have and the experiences that they've had that shape those perspectives, you're able to walk a mile in their shoes. I have a really interesting perspective on conflict. My parents got divorced when I was 4 years old, but it was an incredibly healthy divorce. They showed up to all my baseball games. We had holidays together. Both my parents ended up remarrying. My dad ended up having another kid. And they made a concerted effort when they got divorced to, while they would argue from time to time, it was never in front of me until I was significantly older and I understood both parties' perspectives. They never did that. It was important that they had a shared vision that conflict can only be healthy if it does not impact their son. That's why I'm really comfortable having dynamic, conflict-rich discussions, because I saw what healthy conflict looked like. They modeled it for me at an incredibly young age. So those of you with kids, those managers out there that have employees, let them see what healthy conflict is like. Let them see what a discussion that doesn't devolve into an argument looks like. Show them what a shared vision looks like. Because by understanding the other party's perspective and walking a mile in their shoes, at least you can feel a bit of their experiences and feel a bit of their own feelings. And it's incredibly important to do that, to develop empathy, and empathy leads to understanding. So one of the most important things that we like to talk about here at Aligned is that communication is a really simple formula. Effective communication happens when your intent and their interpretation, and vice versa, match up. And listen, if it's my intent to piss you off and you're pissed off, woohoo, I did it. But if it's my intent to disarm because I'm really uncomfortable and inject a little bit of jokes or humor because I'm literally screaming on the inside, I'm so uncomfortable, and the only thing I can think to do is break a bit of the tension and tell a joke. If you perceive that as me not taking things seriously and making a joke of this and not caring, well, then I didn't communicate effectively. So you have to think about, what is my intent here? And how do I ensure that their interpretation is the same? And that's what we'll leave you with on this session. I hope you found it informative. I'll keep the chat open for a little bit longer to see if anyone's willing to ask a couple questions. We'd love to discuss a few things. And of course, if you need any more support in the world of communication, negotiation, or uncomfortable conversations, drop us a line here at Aligned. You can reach out at hello@alignednegotiation.com. You can check out alignednegotiation.com. You could also engage with us on LinkedIn. Reach out to myself or any of our other partners in the business. We would love to support you. People development and professional development is our number one priority. We want to re-envision the way the world looks at conflict and negotiation. And hopefully, if we can shine a more positive light and have constructive conversations, we can leave the world a better place than we got it. So I'll hang out for a few more. If there's any questions, toss them in the chat. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the holidays. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day today. And hopefully you're standing a little bit taller. Sweet. Sounds like no questions. So I'm going to be out of here, and we'll talk to you next time. See you, everyone.